In the quiet English countryside of Longbourn, the Bennet family had 5 daughters, all in search of good marriages. The lively and intelligent Elizabeth Bennet, the second eldest, was not one to marry for wealth. She wanted love. When the rich and handsome Mr. Bingley moved into the neighborhood, he immediately fell for Jane Bennet, Elizabeth's kind and beautiful sister. However, his close friend, the proud and reserved Mr. Darcy, secretly doubted the match, believing Jane was not genuinely interested. Elizabeth, meanwhile, formed a strong dislike for Darcy. At a ball, he refused to dance with her, calling her tolerable, but not handsome enough to tempt me. Insulted, Elizabeth vowed to think the worst of him. As time passed, Darcy found himself drawn to Elizabeth's wit and spirit, but she remained convinced he was arrogant and cruel, especially after hearing false stories from the charming but deceitful Mr. Wickham. One day, Darcy shocked Elizabeth with a sudden proposal, admitting he loved her despite her lower status. However, his words were filled with pride, and Elizabeth angrily rejected him, accusing him of ruining her sister's happiness and mistreating Wickham. Later, Elizabeth discovered the truth. Darcy had secretly helped her family in a time of crisis and had been misjudged. Humbled, she began to see his true character. When they met again, Darcy was kinder and more reserved. And Elizabeth realized her own prejudice had blinded her to his goodness. After many misunderstandings, she finally accepted his second proposal, knowing this time it was based on mutual respect and love. Thus, pride was humbled, prejudice was overcome, and love triumphed in the end. In the peaceful countryside of Hertfordshire, the small town of Meryton was abuzz with excitement. The news had spread. A wealthy young man, Mr. Charles Bingley, had rented Netherfield Park. This meant one thing: a promising bachelor had entered their world, and every mother with unmarried daughters was eager to introduce them. At the Bennet household, this news was especially thrilling. Mrs. Bennet, whose only mission in life was to see her 5 daughters married well, was determined to ensure that one of them would become Mrs. Bingley. At a grand ball, Mr. Bingley was indeed charming, immediately taking a liking to the eldest Bennet daughter, Jane. She was gentle, kind, and graceful, everything he admired. However, his closest friend, Mr. Fitzwilliam Darcy, was less agreeable. Darcy, a man of great fortune and even greater pride, observed the gathering with little interest. When asked to dance with Elizabeth, he coldly declined, muttering that she was not handsome enough to tempt me. Elizabeth, overhearing this, was both amused and offended, and from that moment, she decided Mr. Darcy was the most arrogant man she had ever met. Days passed. Jane and Bingley grew closer, much to Mrs. Bennet's delight. However, Darcy's presence became more and more irritating to Elizabeth. He was reserved, brooding, and appeared to look down upon everyone around him. Meanwhile, Elizabeth became acquainted with Mr. Wickham, a charming and talkative officer who had a long history with Darcy. Wickham told Elizabeth a heartbreaking story: how Darcy had robbed him of his rightful inheritance. Elizabeth, already biased against Darcy, readily believed Wickham's words. As Bingley's affection for Jane grew, Darcy, believing Jane's feelings were not as deep, convinced Bingley to leave for London. Jane was heartbroken when Bingley departed without a word. Elizabeth, furious, blamed Darcy for destroying her sister's happiness. A few months later, Elizabeth traveled to visit her friend Charlotte, who had married the pompous Mr. Collins. During her stay, she met Darcy again, as he was visiting his wealthy aunt, Lady Catherine de Bourgh. To her great shock, Darcy suddenly confessed his love for her. But rather than a romantic declaration, his words were full of pride. He admitted he loved her despite her lower status and family. Elizabeth was outraged. Instead of accepting, she angrily rejected him, accusing him of cruelty toward both Jane and Wickham. She declared, "Had you behaved in a more gentlemanlike manner, I might have felt compassion. But you have insulted me at every turn." Darcy, though deeply hurt, left without a word. The next morning, Darcy gave Elizabeth a letter, explaining everything. He had separated Jane and Bingley because he truly believed Jane was not deeply in love and wanted to protect his friend. Wickham had lied. In truth, Wickham had attempted to seduce Darcy's young sister, Georgiana, for money. Elizabeth was shaken. She had completely misjudged Darcy, letting her prejudice cloud her perception. Months passed, and Elizabeth's feelings began to change. When she visited Darcy's grand estate, Pemberley, she saw another side of him, kind, generous, and deeply respected by his servants and tenants. She began to realize the man she had despised was not the villain she had imagined. The real turning point came when Elizabeth's youngest sister, Lydia, eloped with Wickham. It was a scandal that could ruin the Bennet family. Darcy, upon hearing of the situation, took action. He secretly tracked down Wickham and paid him to marry Lydia, saving the Bennet family from disgrace. He never told Elizabeth what he had done, but she soon learned the truth from her aunt. This act of selflessness and love changed everything. Elizabeth now saw Darcy as a man of honor and kindness, not pride and arrogance. Soon after, Bingley returned to Jane, realizing his mistake, and they became engaged. Meanwhile, Darcy once again asked for Elizabeth's hand, but this time, with humility and true affection. This time, Elizabeth joyfully accepted, knowing that their love had overcome pride, prejudice, and misunderstandings. Their marriage was not just one of wealth and status, it was a union built on respect, admiration, and true love, and so, Elizabeth and Darcy lived happily ever after, proving that sometimes, first impressions can be misleading, but true love has the power to overcome all obstacles. The day of Elizabeth and Darcy's wedding was one of quiet joy. Unlike the grand, extravagant weddings expected of a man of Darcy's wealth, the ceremony was modest yet elegant, reflecting their true feelings for one another. Mrs. Bennet, overjoyed at Elizabeth's good fortune, boasted to the entire town, declaring, "Who would have thought Lizzie would marry so well? Oh, my dear Mr. Bennet, we shall be the talk of Hertfordshire forever." As Elizabeth took Darcy's hand at the altar, she knew she was entering not just a marriage, but a whole new world, one where she would have to navigate high society, wealth, and the expectations of her new position as mistress of Pemberley. Pemberley, Darcy's grand estate, was even more magnificent than Elizabeth had remembered. The vast lands, the elegant halls filled with history, and the endless responsibilities of running such a household were overwhelming at first. The servants and tenants, who deeply respected Darcy, welcomed Elizabeth warmly, though some whispered about her modest background. However, Elizabeth quickly proved herself to be a gracious and intelligent mistress, earning the admiration of everyone. One of her biggest supporters was Georgiana Darcy, Darcy's shy and gentle younger sister. Elizabeth and Georgiana formed a deep sisterly bond, and Georgiana often confided in Elizabeth, seeing her as a role model. But not everyone was pleased with Elizabeth's new role. Not long after their marriage, Lady Catherine de Bourgh, Darcy's wealthy and controlling aunt, arrived at Pemberley, unannounced and seething with anger. "I warned you, Mr. Darcy," she declared, her voice trembling with outrage. "You have disgraced your family by marrying beneath you. How dare you insult our name with this most unsuitable match?" Elizabeth, never one to be intimidated, responded with confidence, "I am sorry, Lady Catherine, that you find our happiness so offensive. But I assure you, I am perfectly suited to be Mr. Darcy's wife." Darcy, standing firmly beside his wife, dismissed his aunt without hesitation, making it clear that Elizabeth was his choice and his happiness. It was a defining moment. Elizabeth realized just how deeply Darcy had changed, no longer caring for the rigid expectations of society but instead choosing love and loyalty. Though Darcy and Elizabeth were deeply in love, marriage was not without its challenges. Elizabeth struggled to adjust to the formalities of upper-class society, where wealth and status mattered more than wit and intelligence. Some noblewomen looked down on her, whispering about her lack of an aristocratic background. Darcy, while patient and supportive, sometimes struggled to express his emotions, a habit Elizabeth gently helped him overcome. One day, Elizabeth playfully remarked, "Mr. Darcy, you must learn to smile more. People will think you are forever brooding." To her surprise, Darcy did smile, taking her hand. "I only ever smiled in private, before you, Elizabeth. Now, I find myself smiling every day." Their love grew stronger, built on mutual understanding, teasing banter, and deep respect. A few months into their marriage, Jane and Bingley arrived at Pemberley, now happily married and residing in an estate nearby. Their reunion was filled with laughter and warmth, as the two sisters shared stories of their new lives. "And how is dear Mama?" Elizabeth asked with a knowing smile. Jane laughed, still telling every visitor that she always knew you would marry well. Lydia, however, is as careless as ever. Though Lydia and Wickham's marriage had been saved by Darcy's generosity, their life was far from happy. Wickham continued his reckless ways, and Lydia often wrote to Elizabeth, asking for money, a problem Elizabeth and Darcy had to navigate carefully. As the years passed, Elizabeth and Darcy's love only deepened. Their greatest joy came when Elizabeth gave birth to their first child, a son and heir to Pemberley. Darcy, usually composed and reserved, was overcome with emotion at the sight of his newborn son. Holding him gently, he whispered, "He has your spirit, Elizabeth." As their family grew, so did their happiness. They often walked the grand grounds of Pemberley together, reminiscing about how their love had begun, from misunderstandings and arguments to a love that stood the test of time. One evening, as they stood on the balcony overlooking the vast lands of Pemberley, Darcy turned to Elizabeth and said, "I never knew true happiness until you entered my life. You were right, my love, pride and prejudice nearly kept us apart. But now, I am the happiest man alive." Elizabeth smiled, taking his hand. "And I, the happiest woman. For in all the world, there is no place I would rather be than here. By your side." As they stood together, watching the sunset over Pemberley, it was clear, theirs was a love that had conquered all, a love that would last for eternity. Pride and Prejudice is not just a story of love, it is a story of growth, understanding, and the power of overcoming one's own flaws. Elizabeth and Darcy's journey proves that love is not just about passion, but also about learning, accepting, and choosing each other every single day. And so, the tale of Mr. and Mrs. Darcy continues, not just in books but in the hearts of every reader who believes in the power of true love. As the years passed, Pemberley flourished under Elizabeth and Darcy's care. Elizabeth, once seen as an outsider in high society, had now become a respected and beloved mistress. She was not only known for her intelligence and charm but also for her compassion. She frequently visited the local tenants, helped educate the children of Pemberley's workers, and even organized charitable efforts to aid the poor. Darcy, once a man burdened by pride and formality, had softened in Elizabeth's presence. While he remained dignified and authoritative, there was a warmth in his eyes that only Elizabeth had ever been able to bring out. Together, they had created a home filled with laughter, love, and harmony. Meanwhile, Georgiana Darcy, once shy and reserved, had grown into a graceful and confident young woman. After years of gentle guidance from Elizabeth, she learned to trust her own heart, but finding a suitable match was not easy. Her wealth made her a target for fortune seekers, and her brother was fiercely protective. It was at a London ball that Georgiana met Colonel James Wentworth, a dashing yet modest military officer who had served with distinction. Unlike the many suitors who flattered her for her fortune, Wentworth admired Georgiana for her kindness and strength. When he first met Darcy, Wentworth stood tall and unshaken, showing that he was a man of honor. One evening, as Elizabeth and Darcy walked together, Elizabeth smiled and said, "Do you remember when you objected to Bingley marrying Jane? And now here you are, watching your sister fall in love with a man without a title." Darcy smirked, "It seems I have learned much from my wife." When Wentworth finally asked for Georgiana's hand, Darcy gave his blessing, not because of the colonel's status, but because of his integrity and love for Georgiana. Their wedding was a joyful occasion, and as Georgiana and Wentworth set off to begin their new life together, Elizabeth knew that the Darcys had truly found happiness at last. As time passed, each of the Bennet sisters found their own paths in life. Jane and Bingley lived in harmony, raising their children in a warm and loving household. Mary, once awkward and bookish, surprised everyone by marrying a scholar from Oxford, where she found an intellectual equal. Kitty, influenced by Elizabeth's example, matured into a refined young woman and made a respectable marriage. Lydia, however, was not so fortunate. Her marriage to Wickham had been a disaster. He continued to gamble, drink, and waste their money. Though Lydia never admitted her regret, she often wrote to Elizabeth, asking for financial help. Darcy and Elizabeth debated whether to intervene. "She is my sister," Elizabeth sighed. "But she must learn responsibility." In the end, they sent a small allowance for Lydia's children, but Wickham himself was never allowed near Pemberley again. Years passed, and soon, Pemberley echoed with the laughter of children. Elizabeth and Darcy had 3 children. Each with their own unique personality. 1. Alexander Fitzwilliam Darcy, their eldest son and heir, who had his father's quiet strength and his mother's sharp wit. 2. Charlotte and Darcy, named after Elizabeth's dearest friend, she was full of energy and mischief, always questioning society's rules. 3. Henry Bennet Darcy, the youngest, with a love for books and stories, much like his uncle Bingley. Elizabeth and Darcy raised their children to be kind, intelligent, and independent thinkers, determined that they would not fall into the same prejudices that once divided them. One day, as Elizabeth walked through Pemberley's gardens with her children, little Charlotte asked, "Mama, is it true that you didn't like Papa when you first met him?" Elizabeth laughed, glancing at Darcy. "It is true, my darling. I thought him the proudest, most unpleasant man I had ever met." Darcy smirked, "And I thought your mother was the most stubborn woman in England." Alexander, ever the observer, asked, "Then how did you fall in love?" Elizabeth smiled, taking Darcy's hand. "Because we learned that love is not about first impressions. It is about understanding, growth, and choosing each other every day." Darcy pressed a gentle kiss to Elizabeth's hand and added, "And because I could never resist your mother's wit." Years later, as Elizabeth and Darcy grew older, Pemberley remained a place of warmth and happiness. Their children grew into fine young adults, ready to write their own stories. One evening, as Darcy and Elizabeth sat together, watching the sunset over the rolling hills, Elizabeth whispered, "Can you believe how far we've come?" Darcy, his hair now touched with silver, pulled her close and said, "Every moment with you, Elizabeth, has been worth more than all the riches in the world." As they sat together, surrounded by their family, their love story became more than just a tale of pride and prejudice. It became a legacy, one that would endure for generations, and so, the story of Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy continued, not just in books, but in the hearts of all who believe that true love is worth fighting for. Years passed, and Pemberley remained a place of joy and prosperity, ruled with wisdom by Mr. and Mrs. Darcy. Their children, now young adults, were ready to make their mark on the world. Alexander Fitzwilliam Darcy, the eldest son and heir, was reserved yet deeply intelligent, much like his father. He felt the weight of responsibility that came with inheriting Pemberley. Charlotte and Darcy, the second-born, was independent, witty, and adventurous, a true daughter of Elizabeth Bennet. She questioned society's rules and had no intention of marrying purely for status. Henry Bennet Darcy, the youngest, was thoughtful, gentle, and deeply interested in literature and philosophy. Unlike Alexander, he had no desire for wealth or power. His heart was set on exploring the world and writing about it. The Darcys raised their children with a balance of privilege and humility, ensuring they understood kindness mattered more than social rank. As the heir to Pemberley, Alexander knew his duty: to marry well, secure the estate's future, and uphold the Darcy name. But he despised the endless London balls and matchmaking mothers throwing their daughters at him. One summer, while traveling through Derbyshire, he met Eleanor Whitmore, the daughter of a respected but modestly wealthy family. Unlike the ladies of the ton, Eleanor was fiercely independent and uninterested in social status. She loved the countryside, riding through the hills, and reading poetry, qualities that captivated Alexander. Yet, he feared his father's expectations. One evening, after weeks of growing tension, Elizabeth found her son deep in thought at Pemberley's library. "Mother," he said hesitantly, "must I marry for duty rather than love?" Elizabeth smiled, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Do you forget how your father and I came together? Love, my dear Alexander, is the greatest fortune one can have. Follow your heart, and you will never regret it." With his mother's blessing, Alexander defied societal expectations and married Eleanor, choosing love, just as his parents once had. Darcy, though initially hesitant, saw in Eleanor the same strength and wit that he had once fallen for in Elizabeth. And so, Pemberley gained a new mistress, and the next generation of Darcys thrived in love and understanding. Unlike her brothers, Charlotte and Darcy had no interest in marriage. She was far more interested in horseback riding, reading political essays, and challenging the expectations placed upon women. At every ball, she skillfully avoided proposals, using her wit to deflect even the most persistent suitors. But one day, a mysterious gentleman arrived in Derbyshire, a man known only as Captain Nathaniel Stirling, a retired naval officer. Rumors surrounded him. Some said he was a war hero, others whispered he was a man disgraced, No one knew where he came from or why he had come to Derbyshire. Charlotte, always drawn to a challenge, was determined to uncover his secrets. Their first encounter was tense yet thrilling. She found him infuriatingly arrogant, and he found her unlike any woman he had ever met. As time passed, she discovered the truth. Captain Stirling had once been accused of treason, a crime he did not commit. His family had disowned him, and he had lived in exile. Until now, instead of fearing scandal, Charlotte stood by his side, determined to prove his innocence. With the help of her father's influence and her mother's cleverness, she uncovered the real culprit and restored his honor. Stirling, deeply moved by Charlotte's courage, confessed his love. And for the first time in her life, Charlotte found herself willing to embrace love, not as a duty, but as a choice. They married in a small but joyous ceremony, proving that love, when tested, only grows stronger. The youngest Darcy, Henry Bennet Darcy, was a dreamer. Unlike his brother and sister, he had no desire for wealth, estates, or high society. Instead, he longed for adventure, knowledge, and the open road. One evening, he told his parents, "I wish to travel, to see the world beyond Pemberley. I want to write, to learn, to live among people who do not care for names and fortunes." Darcy, though reluctant, saw in his son the same independent spirit that had once drawn him to Elizabeth. And so, with their blessing, Henry set off on a grand journey across Europe, writing letters home filled with tales of distant lands, philosophers and poets, his own search for meaning in a world so obsessed with wealth and power. Years later, he returned, a man wiser and more thoughtful, carrying stories of love, hardship, and beauty. He had found his own path, proving that a Darcy's worth was not measured by inheritance, but by the depth of their heart and mind. As Elizabeth and Darcy grew older, they watched their children find happiness in ways they never expected. One evening, as they sat in the grand halls of Pemberley, Darcy took Elizabeth's hand. "We have built a legacy, Elizabeth," he murmured. "A home filled with love, not just duty. A family that values kindness over status." Elizabeth smiled, leaning into him. "And to think, it all began with a single dance, and a rather rude remark about my beauty." Darcy chuckled. "Yes, and you have never let me forget it." As they gazed upon their grandchildren playing in the gardens, they knew that the story of Pride and Prejudice was more than just their love. It was the story of generations shaped by choice, understanding, and the triumph of love over societal expectations. And as the sun set over Pemberley, their love story continued, not just in the lives of their children, but in the hearts of all who believed that true love is worth fighting for. By the time Elizabeth and Darcy entered their later years, Pemberley had become a symbol of love, wisdom, and progress. Their children, Alexander, Charlotte, and Henry, had each carved their own unique paths in life, but the next generation was beginning to take shape. Alexander and his wife Eleanor had 3 children, each of whom carried a blend of Darcy's dignity and Elizabeth's spirit. Williamsport will Darcy too, the eldest son and the future master of Pemberley, a mirror of his grandfather, but with his mother's warmth. 1. Margaret Maggie Darcy, intelligent, rebellious, and determined to challenge society's expectations for women. 2. Edward Darcy, quiet and introspective, more interested in books and the arts than business and estates. Charlotte and her husband, Captain Nathaniel Stirling, had twin daughters, Amelia and Cecily, both of whom inherited their mother's fiery spirit and their father's adventurous nature. Henry, the traveler, had finally found love in Italy, where he married a spirited Venetian woman named Isabella Romano. Together, they had a son, Leo Darcy, who was raised with a love of both England and Italy. As Elizabeth and Darcy watched their grandchildren grow, they saw in them the same spirit of love and defiance that had defined their own romance so many years ago. As the eldest grandson and heir, young Will faced the same pressures his grandfather once did. He was expected to be the master of Pemberley, to marry well, and to uphold the family's name. But Will had his own struggles. Unlike his grandfather, he was not naturally proud or reserved. He was thoughtful and kind, but he despised the expectations placed upon him. At a grand London ball, Will met Lady Genevieve Harrington, a woman of impeccable breeding and beauty. Everyone expected their engagement, but Will's heart was elsewhere. One day, while visiting a village school in Derbyshire, Will met Lillian Lily Gardiner, the daughter of a schoolteacher. She was brilliant, outspoken, and unafraid to challenge him. She cared nothing for his wealth or title. Instead of curtsying, she debated philosophy with him. For the first time in his life, Will felt seen for who he truly was, not for his status. But their love was forbidden. A Darcy could not marry the daughter of a schoolteacher. When he confessed his love to his father, Alexander hesitated. The weight of tradition bore down on him. Pemberley must have a mistress of noble standing, Alexander said, but Elizabeth, now a grandmother, yet still as wise as ever, stepped forward. Have we learned nothing, Alexander? She asked. Must I remind you that love is not dictated by society? Your father and I faced these same doubts, and yet here we stand, proof that love is always the right choice. With his grandmother's encouragement, Will defied expectations and chose Lily. Their love shocked society, but it also ushered in a new era for Pemberley, one where love, not birthright, determined a person's worth. Will's younger sister, Margaret Maggie Darcy, was even more rebellious than her brother. She refused to marry for status. She was an advocate for women's education, inspired by her grandmother's strong will. Instead of seeking a husband, she sought a purpose. At age 21, Maggie traveled to London and began writing essays under a pseudonym, advocating for women's rights and social reform. Her writing caught the attention of Thomas Sinclair, a young politician fighting for change. They met in secret, exchanging letters and debating issues of the day. Maggie soon realized she had met her intellectual equal, but as a Darcy, she was expected to marry a nobleman, not a radical politician. One evening, Darcy himself sat with Maggie in the study and asked, "Do you love him?" Maggie hesitated, then nodded. "Then marry him," Darcy said simply. Maggie threw her arms around her grandfather, realizing that despite his once proud nature, he had always put love above all else. Her marriage to Thomas was unconventional, but legendary. Together, they fought for education reform, the rights of women, and the future of England itself. As time went on, Elizabeth and Darcy grew older, their love never fading. One winter evening, as the snow fell gently outside, Darcy sat in his study, reading one of Elizabeth's favorite books aloud to her. "Do you remember when we first met?" Elizabeth asked softly. "How could I forget?" Darcy said with a small smile. "You were the only woman who ever dared to put me in my place." Elizabeth laughed, then squeezed his hand. "We have had a good life, haven't we?" she whispered. "The very best," Darcy murmured, and as the fire crackled and the snow fell, the two of them drifted into sleep, together, as they had always been, their love eternal. The next morning, Pemberley awoke to a world without its beloved matriarch and patriarch. But though Elizabeth and Darcy were gone, their legacy endured. Their children and grandchildren carried forward their lessons. That love is stronger than pride, that character matters more than birthright, that true happiness is found in the freedom to choose one's own path. And so, as the sun rose over Pemberley, a new era began, one shaped by the love story that had changed everything. With the passing of Mr. and Mrs. Darcy, Pemberley was now under the stewardship of Fitzwilliam Will Darcy II, the eldest grandson. The grand estate had seen decades of love, loss, and triumph, and now, as England entered a new century, so too did the Darcy family. Will and Lily Darcy, the schoolteacher's daughter, had settled into their roles as the new master and mistress of Pemberley, determined to continue the values of love, kindness, and progress that Will's grandparents had instilled. Maggie Darcy and her husband, Thomas Sinclair, led political and social reforms, fighting for education, worker rights, and equality. Edward Darcy, the dreamer and artist, left for Paris, where he mingled with poets and painters, carrying the Darcy spirit of rebellion and passion into the world of art. Amelia and Cecily Sterling, Charlotte's adventurous twin daughters, had embarked on daring expeditions, refusing to be confined to the traditional roles of women. As England changed, so too did the Darcys, yet they remained a family defined by courage, love, and the defiance of societal expectations. As the children of Will and Lily Darcy came of age, they each faced their own battles between duty and heart. Julian Darcy, the torn heir Julian, the eldest son of Will and Lily, bore the weight of his family name heavily. He was expected to inherit Pemberley, just as his father had, but Julian longed for adventure, for meaning beyond titles and estates. One fateful summer, while traveling through India, Julian met Ananya Bose, the daughter of a scholar. She was brilliant, fearless, and deeply passionate about her homeland's fight for independence. Julian found himself drawn to her intelligence and courage, yet he knew that their love would be controversial and difficult. He faced the same choice his ancestors had faced, to follow his heart or fulfill his duty. Love is stronger than pride, character matters more than status. True happiness is found in choosing one's own path. As another century dawned, the Darcys remained a family of thinkers, lovers, and rebels, always shaping the world with the power of love and conviction. Their story would never truly end, for as long as there were Darcys, there would always be those willing to fight for love over prejudice. The year is 2025. Pemberley, now a historical estate and cultural landmark, remains the heart of the Darcy family's legacy. Though centuries have passed, the values of Elizabeth and Darcy still influence their descendants, even in the modern world. Meet the latest Darcys. William Liam Darcy IV, the current heir to Pemberley, a brilliant yet reserved entrepreneur who struggles with the weight of his family's history. Elena Darcy, a fierce human rights lawyer, determined to fight for justice, much like her ancestor Eliza Darcy. Theo Darcy, the artistic, rebellious younger brother who wants nothing to do with aristocratic life, choosing instead to become a documentary filmmaker, uncovering global injustices, despite living in the modern era, the age-old Darcy conflict remains. Do we follow tradition, or do we follow our hearts? Liam, the eldest and heir to Pemberley Holdings, is a self-made billionaire in the world of technology and sustainable energy. Unlike his ancestors, his challenges are not arranged marriages and societal expectations. His struggle is legacy. Everyone expects him to marry well, protect the family name, and uphold tradition. The media sees him as an enigma, handsome, powerful, but emotionally guarded. Behind closed doors, he longs for something real, something that isn't dictated by wealth or family obligations. Then he meets Maya Bennett, a brilliant AI researcher and the great-great-granddaughter of Elizabeth Bennett's sister, Jane. Maya is modern, independent, and has no interest in aristocracy or wealth. She challenges Liam's every belief about love, duty, and family. When the press discovers their relationship, scandal erupts. The billionaire and the commoner, a modern-day Darcy love story. Liam must decide, does he risk his carefully built empire for love, just as his ancestors did? One evening, standing outside Pemberley under the moonlight, Maya whispers, "You don't have to carry their burdens, Liam. You can make your own path." And in that moment, history repeats itself. A Darcy once again must choose between duty and heart. Elena, Liam's younger sister, is a brilliant human rights lawyer who travels across the world to fight injustice, corruption, and inequality. She is fiercely independent, refusing to live under the shadow of the Darcy name. She exposes corporate crimes and defends the oppressed, often putting herself in dangerous situations. The media calls her the Rebel of Pemberley, a title she wears with pride. But even a woman as strong as Elena has her own struggles, particularly with love. Enter Daniel Whitmore, a journalist who shares her passion for justice. They butt heads constantly, arguing over legal strategies and ethics. Yet, despite their differences, they can't deny their chemistry. One evening in New York, after a heated debate about corporate law, Daniel smirks and says, "You know, for someone who claims to hate aristocracy, you certainly act like a queen." Elena raises an eyebrow. "And for someone who claims to be objective, you certainly seem obsessed with me." As they laugh, the walls between them crumble. Perhaps even the most independent Darcys aren't immune to love. Theo, the youngest of the modern Darcys, is the family's black sheep. He rejects wealth, power, and tradition, choosing instead to document global injustices through film. His latest project, exposing corruption in multinational corporations, one of which is deeply tied to the Darcy empire. When his film threatens to take down powerful allies of his own family, Theo is faced with an impossible choice. Do I remain loyal to my family, or do I stand by my principles? His journey takes him to war zones, refugee camps, and hidden boardrooms, uncovering secrets even his family doesn't know. And along the way, he meets Isabella Romano, an activist who refuses to back down from danger. Isabella sees through Theo's privileged guilt and forces him to confront his own privilege. Together, they create a documentary that shakes the world, but also puts them in immense danger. When Theo is arrested in a foreign country for exposing government crimes, his brother Liam mobilizes the Darcy influence to free him. And for the first time in years, the three siblings, Liam, Elena, and Theo, realize that despite their differences, they are still a family. Even in the 21st century, the same questions remain. Do we let society define us, or do we carve our own path? Do we let wealth and power dictate our choices, or do we follow our hearts? Do we cling to tradition, or do we embrace change? And just like Elizabeth and Darcy centuries ago, their descendants continue to choose love, integrity, and courage. As Liam and Maya stand on the balcony of Pemberley, gazing at the centuries-old estate, Maya asks, "Do you ever feel like we're just part of history repeating itself?" Liam smirks. "Maybe. But if history keeps leading us back to love, then I think we're doing something right." And with that, the Darcy legacy continues, forever evolving, yet always rooted in the same timeless truth: love conquers all. The world is unrecognizable from the days of Elizabeth and Darcy. Artificial intelligence and technology dominate society. Space travel is as common as taking a flight once was. Social structures have changed, but the battle between tradition and progress still exists. Pemberley, the centuries-old estate, still stands, though now, it is more than just a historic landmark. It has become a hub of knowledge, culture, and diplomacy, where the world's greatest minds gather. The Darcy name is legendary, representing honor, intellect, and defiance of societal norms, and at the center of it all are the next generation of Darcys, still wrestling with the same old questions. Who are we meant to be? Who do we choose to love? And what is more important, duty or passion? Cassandra Cass Darcy, the heiress of the Darcy Empire, is a brilliant quantum scientist. She was raised with the weight of Pemberley's history on her shoulders, but unlike her ancestors, she doesn't just oversee land, she controls one of the world's most advanced AI networks. Her latest creation, ELIZA, is the world's first fully sentient AI, a tribute to her legendary ancestor, Elizabeth Bennet. But Cass faces an impossible dilemma. The Global Intelligence Council demands that ELIZA be turned over to the government. Cass knows that once AI is controlled by corporations and politicians, free thought will be lost forever. The only person who supports her rebellion? Adrian Bingley, a rogue hacker from an old rival family. Their love is forbidden, a Bingley and a Darcy, once again at odds. But history has a way of bringing hearts together, no matter the obstacles. As Cass and Adrian fight to free ELIZA, they uncover secrets that could change the course of history, and prove once again that a true Darcy will always fight for freedom and love.